Welcome to the Bearded Bereans, where we analyze topics of the day in the light of the scriptures.
Well, welcome to the third episode of Season 2 of the Bearded Bereans. My name is Cole Strawn, and I am joined by, is that the way you say that? Jason Bolt and Maxim Nelkin. And we are all... What's that? What's that, Max?
I say you managed to butcher my name. Unbelievable.
Maxime, excuse me.
Maxim Antonievich Nelkin.
I'm not going to say the last part.
Come on. People are listening.
People are listening. Yeah. Well, before we introduce the topic of today, I'm just curious, did anybody bring anything good along with them tonight?
Did you really have to ask this question, Cole?
I know you did.
Of course.
Yeah, what
did you bring?
Nice.
He's being difficult tonight, Kay.
He's got choices again.
Oh, choices. There we go. What do we got?
A whitey or a blackie? That's not what I meant. Light or dark? I mean, I don't know what was that in a way. I'm telling you, today's world, you cannot just pick. You laugh about it. I'm serious now. You smoke at 10 o'clock at night, then you're awake at 4. So
would it be better for you to take the lighter one tonight?
I don't know. I might do the dark one, man.
He's going to do the dark one. We all know it. It's just a little charade, a little game that he plays, and then he picks the dark one.
And then I'll finish with the light one. That's probably what's going to happen.
So what is the dark one tonight?
Padron. Maduro.
What is that? 4,000?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, it's probably 2,000.
It's strange that Padron's the Churchill ones. It's like Dark Horse. It's been gone for about 2 years. And Padron just now saying that they might be discontinuing, which was that was the most popular size. So I mean, I don't know if it's for sure. Hopefully they won't do that. But I've been doing 4,000, which is a little bit perfect length, a little bit bigger gauge that I like. So, what about you guys? What you got going on there?
Well, I've got a nice treat here. I have a half of what was another gift from a teacher of mine, which, by the way, that's how you know you have a really amazing faculty, is when they give you cigars for Christmas.
Amen.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So it's an AJ Fernandez Belas Artes. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't ever had one, but I'm about to at least have half of one, but don't tell the person who gave it to me that I chopped it in half, because he'll probably be offended. But that's okay.
Don't share with him the podcast.
Well, maybe he's forgotten what he gave me.
That's not a good podcast growth strategy there, Jay.
Well, he's just going to be offended then, I guess. That's okay.
That's okay.
What's the profile of that? It looks like a medium to me.
It's it's dark. It's like a San Andreas something, I think. I don't know. I'm not really sure.
Okay. What's the binder? What's the filler? Do you know?
Don't know. You now know as much about it as I do.
Okay.
You need to give a review like you did on the last one. I am lighting up another AJ Fernandez masterpiece. A masterpiece is probably making it too far. It's a Virtue from Man of War. And
you really come to be a fond about them, right? Fond of them?
Yeah, I am. I'm fond. Really, there's only one cigar that I've had in my illustrious career of smoking cigars that I really dislike. And it's one called Obsidian White Noise. Have you ever seen those?
Yes.
They're terrible.
Yes.
So
that's what you smoked before you met us. So
that's what I was called before I met you. White
It's
noise?
what you smoked before you met Jay and I. We put you
Yeah.
on the straight path to the good cigars.
Yeah, well, no, I actually smoked this. Like, people know I've never smoked before I met you two. You know this, Max.
I do. I do.
But
Glad to
you say,
be here. Listen,
anyway,
do you get your virtue on a cigarbeat.com or where do you go usually?
I had a very good friend send me this virtue. Um, but yeah, I usually go to Cigar Bed if I want a very good friend sending me cigars.
Yeah, I need to go
So,
get some. But anyways, we need to get back to the show.
so what are we talking about tonight?
Well, we're discussing, of course, Neil Gordon's essay titled Escaping the Beast, where he takes Crane Britton's Anatomy of a Revolution and summarizes it and then talks about where he thinks our society currently is and what he calls the modern American Revolution. And so we've introduced that. Last time we talked through Gordon's analysis of Britton and kind of walked through the 6 stages that Gordon identifies in Britton that a revolution goes through. So that was kind of fun, and we'll pick up today on what Gordon says is the current stage of the modern American Revolution. But it might be helpful just to kind of run through those stages again real quick and give a brief summary before we jump into where we're currently at. Sound good?
Yeah. Well, let's
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah. So Gordon, just reading through Britton, if I can keep all these names straight, he identifies these 6 stages, and Britton doesn't actually say this is stage 1 and this is stage 2, but he identifies early signs, preliminary signs, and then kind of the first stage, and then he talks about the new regime, and then the third regime, and then the fourth regime. But there's events that take place through all of that Gordon brings out for us. And so he identifies these early stages as periods in which there's some economic unrest, there's a switch of allegiance amongst the elites and the academics, where they've started to criticize the old regime in order to get rid of it. They start to see the old regime not just as problematic, but actually as the problem. And so rather than criticizing it in order to make it better, they're criticizing it because they want to get rid of it. There's some violence, some protest, there's propaganda that starts to come out. And these things don't always lead to revolution, but they're always present prior to a revolution. So from there, there's what he calls the first stage, I think, where these revolutionaries pose some kind of an actual threat. Whether that's just a rhetorical threat or whether that's a physical threat, whether they take up arms or not, they seek to displace the old regime and actually come into power themselves. And that marks what Britton calls a fork in the road, where the old regime can then either respond with sufficient force to destroy the revolution, and it ends right there in what he calls an aborted revolution, or it doesn't respond with sufficient force, either rhetorical force or with potentially military force, and the revolution continues. And he actually says that fork in the road determines the success of the revolution. If the old regime obviously responds with enough force to squash it, it's over and it doesn't succeed. But if it doesn't respond with enough force, that the revolution succeeds. Not at that point, but ultimately it will, because the old regime has demonstrated that it's either unwilling or unable to stop the revolution. And it has the effect of bolstering the revolution and saying, hey, look, we can actually do this. And it may take them some more time still, but that is the point at which, according to Britton, the revolution either fails or succeeds. And so from there, if the old regime doesn't respond with sufficient force, there is ultimately a new regime that takes over, a new regime of moderates. He calls this the second regime. So there's this second regime of moderates. He says the moderates are the ones who are, gifted at debate and discourse, and they're familiar with methods of ruling and that sort of thing. And so they sort of naturally come into power. And then we end up with this period of dual sovereignty where there's this new second regime that's actually in power, but there's this reign of moderates, or not a reign of moderates, but not moderates, a group of extremists who will start to critique this second regime and start to say, oh, they're still doing the things that the old regime was doing. And so these extremists will start to build their own institutions and set up basically like a parallel government almost. And over time, these extremists will be able to critique this second regime enough and ultimately displace it. And then the extremists will ultimately take over. At which point he says that, Britton says that they will bring in what he calls the reign of terror. So think of the actual reign of terror from the French Revolution. Think of Stalin and the peasants and farmers in Russia. Think of Mao and the Cultural Revolution. We talked about our own American reign of terror after the Revolutionary War, in which during this time they systematically raze everything that is connected to the old regime in any way. So that's people, that's institutions, that's statues, that's buildings, that's flags, everything. All of it has to go, and they end up with a clean slate on which they can then build a new society in the image of whatever they want.
Right.
From there, Britton says people can only stand that for so long. Like, you can only abuse a society for so long before they're like, wait a minute, this kind of sucks, it's and they start to pine for what they had before. And he says ultimately these extremists will give way to then a fourth regime of moderates, not the same moderates as before, but a new one coming in, who will sort of establish what he calls the new normal, and then that will be the thing that is carried forward. So I don't know if we hit all six of them in there, but that's the summary.
Well, I remember my experience reading through the first time, and I still have that experience in hearing your summary, where I'm automatically placing different events in our history, from the sexual revolution on, to those things that you're discussing, those different categories, those different phases under revolution. And I want to, think about the person that has never heard these things before. There are people that are not particularly politically engaged. They're not quite aware of what's going on. And they look around them and they know something's off. They know something's wrong. They know something seems a little bit out of touch with reality even. And I talk to them all the time. There are people that really do not see that we are in the middle of a revolution as we speak. They know that things have gotten bad. They know culture is not what it was when they were growing up. They don't know how. They don't know why. They don't know that it was intentional. Right? And so I really think that the landmark realization that I want a listener to understand as they listen through this is, these phases that we're talking through last week, summary this week, have clearly taken place, most of them. And we're in a specific moment. And it's hard to just really peg exactly which moment we are, but I think we've become pretty close.
Yeah, that's one of the things we mentioned before, was that, in hindsight, it's much easier to look back, 100 years ago and say, well, this is maybe the turning point, or this is when this stage moved into this stage. but in the moment, it's much more difficult. It's not an exact science. There's overlap between the phases. And so, it's hard to say, well, we're exactly here, but we can get a pretty good idea just by looking at the things that have taken place and putting those things on Brinton's map. We can get a pretty good idea of roughly where we're at and what we can expect to see in the coming years.
I agree. I will say I agree with both of you, and I'll mute myself again when it rain passes by or back away.
It's raining at Max's house.
Yeah, and it's super loud.
Wow.
I can barely hear you guys. It's really loud.
We can look at a few of the things that Britton says, and then maybe I think it'd be good to analyze what he says and see if he's accurate or not. And maybe we have some things to add to it. So, so he does a few things. He defines the old regime for our context now, which I think will be really helpful. Then he talks about the preliminary signs, which have been prevalent for some time. And then he talks through kind of the first stages and then where he thinks we're at now. So we can kind of just walk through that step by step and comment along the way. But the old regime, in our context, I think it's important that we define it. And here's how Gordon defines our old regime in our context now. He says that Britton uses the term old regime to refer to the network of political power that the revolution seeks to displace. So generally speaking, that's what the old regime refers to. So if you think back to the original American Revolution, the old regime was the English crown. In the Russian Revolution, the old regime was the Tsar. If we apply Brinton then to our current context, the old regime, and here's the quote from Brinton, the old regime is the conglomerate of the institutions, the values, and the traditions that are enshrined in the Constitution and that shaped America from the beginning. The old regime is not any particular person or political party, but rather things like the rule of law, an independent judiciary, freedom of speech, federalism, and the Electoral College. The old regime is all the things that made America what it was. So I think sometimes we get caught up in, are we talking about a certain presidential administration, that sort of thing. But no, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about institutions that have made our nation, our society, what it is, or what it has been, at least.
Yeah, and you hear as you read that quote, just for instance, the Electoral College. That's an institution that's been questioned quite often since, I don't know, as long as I can remember. I know Bush-Gore election they came into play, as being something that the cry was, this is unfair to the popular vote. This is, so this has been questioned for a while. And I think we only see more and more of that as time goes on. To a point where, in 2016, Hillary wins. And I want to almost equate this with elections, period, in our country, not just the Electoral College, but elections, period. But, it seems Hillary wins or Hillary loses. They cry foul. Her supporters cry foul. This was a rigged election. This was Russian interference. That's how Trump won. All those things were being said. And then we move into 2020 where, there's abundant reason to question the results of that election. And it's a roundly criticized and untwisted institution that we have in our country right now.
Oh, yeah. I read an article.
One aspect on that list.
Yeah. I read an article just this morning that talked about a poll that was recently done that found something like, regardless of how the next election turns out, 50% of the people are going to question the legitimacy of it. It used to be that 50% of the people would be disappointed with the outcome. Now 50% of the people are like, well, this isn't even legit. So
Right.
that's a big shift.
Huge shift.
But I think this change began quite a while. I mean, we can look at the age with hippies and then public education going into the control by the liberal sector, going the 90s coming in. I mean, it's been being brewed and cooked for some time. And so people that wise, they can look at the history, analyze it, pull this principle out and apply it to our culture, they can see it. And people have been talking about this. I mean, we had this interview, 1984 interview from KGB, when he talks about how they plan to take over, and I forget the guy's name. And then we look at this. It's fascinating how many things are just by textbook. And so that's where we are. This is the reality. The old regime, the capitalism, must go, and everybody who is there. Family ideas will not be tolerated.
Yeah, so the things that he mentions again, the rule of law, an independent judiciary, freedom of speech, federalism, and the electoral college. These are just examples of the old regime. There's a lot more that we could throw in there. We could throw Christianity in there, the structure of the family, free market capitalism. There's a whole bunch of things that go into it. But even as I list these things off, these are all things that have come into question and in many ways have already been eliminated. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking rule of law. Let's talk about, the summer of peace where there were certain individuals kept out. Was it Saginaw? It was in Oregon or Washington. Seattle.
Yeah, I was in Seattle.
The Chaz, Chad, whatever. Yeah, they call it all sorts of different things. But even the riots that happened over the BLM riots, the riots that happened, after Hillary lost in 2016, Ferguson in 2015, rampant looting, the refusal of liberal DAs to bring charges against people of color, the absolute disregard for the rule of law has only gotten worse over the last 10 years. There's been no improvement whatsoever.
We could throw a border in there as one of the institutions of the old regime. That's gone.
Yeah, it doesn't exist anymore.
It doesn't
exist. Except for a little bit of razor wire in Texas.
Yeah, in one little state park. Yeah, the border's gone. I mean, we could go on and on about all these things that once defined us as a people, as a society, and those things no longer define us.
Mm-hmm.
They really don't. Gordon says that all of the preliminary signs have been present in America for decades. He talks about, economically, we're a prosperous nation, but April 15th is around the corner. We all feel the squeeze when April 15th rolls around. The government has completely monopolized industries like education. It regulates nearly to death industries like medicine and energy. So many of these signs have been present for decades. He says decades have passed since the intellectuals transferred their allegiance. There's this great quote I'll have to read for you. He says, finding a professor at a state-run university who supports the old regime is like finding a man who can give birth. People say it can happen, but those of us with at least one foot in reality know it's not possible.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. The old regime is really just a vestige in our memory.
Yeah.
There is no old regime left, and it's funny to see people fight over the scraps. This was happening, right? There's clearly thought leaders that are one of the prize of the Republican in name only, the rhinos, lately is we've got to respect the institutions. We've got to protect the institutions. What institutions?
Yeah.
What are you talking about? Those are gone.
Yep.
Of course, they're talking about different areas of government, whether it be election or or what have you. But there's really no saving what isn't there. It's crumbled.
Yeah. Gordon says that what the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci called the long march through the institutions. He says the long march through public education that began 100 years ago is complete, and and it started there and has moved systematically through. Education, obviously every government controlled school is a Marxist institution. Think about the churches that have liberalized, the mainstream churches, and the stuff that they're propagating. You think of our own government and the things that you just listed off, not prosecuting criminals and those sorts of things. Even the military being indoctrinated and filled with woke ideology. Just one by one, all of these institutions, Marxism has marched its way straight through them.
West Point just removed their old slogan. Was it for duty, honor, to something now to replace that with army values? And West Point there is no higher institution military level. So they removed the old slogan and replaced with army values and whatever that is. You go figure it out. Just what you guys are talking about. It's the burning of the books, the witch hunt and burning of the witches of modern era is way, way underway. It's here, and this is why when I'm listening, I'm hearing people talking, well, we just gotta vote. You just voting is not gonna make a difference. You gotta stand up and being involved in what's going on. Vote is how we express, but just not doing anything else, just going to the whatever you call it, box once every 4 years or every 2 years. We need to be involved in our communities with our people, our children. We are a community people. That's how human race is built. But this regime, look at this stuff. This starts happening when the technology is, and I might be wrong, this is just my ideas. Some of them are crazy. But as you look at the progression of the technology, and once the technology got to the place when it starts separating families and to individualize them and separate them and put them in a box and put whatever you want those hats to whatever means they have, that's when all this starts happening. You look at technological peril and stuff, it's crazy. And I'm talking about just our era. It may not be true for those eras in the past. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about our era, what we have lived through, and how this worked hand in hand together. Very crafty. And of course, I look at this from the Christian perspective. The beast is crafty. Very crafty. And I'm not surprised. This is not something that they just came up over the night. It's been working for decades, preparing and working very patiently.
So Antonio Gramsci, this Italian Marxist, his long march through the institutions, it was designed as a way to overthrow an old regime and replace it with a Marxist regime in a way that would happen so slowly that no one would notice, and that it wouldn't ever require, fighting a war or doing anything like that. We could just slowly, systematically, over the course of a century, work our way through all of the institutions, remove the ones we don't want, replace them with what we do want, and then there will be a revolution that will have succeeded, and no one will even realize it, which is it's exactly what Gordon says has happened.
You have to tip your hat to him.
Oh,
he was a genius.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody that's planned something so effectively, and he was never here to see it. It's interesting. I've heard this podcast episode from Cross Politic. It was about postmillennialism. He goes, "You may not be postmillennial, but they are, and that's why they're winning." And we all have our disagreements with certain eschatology, but
Yeah.
he's got a point there. And it's Gretzky's not around to see it. Yep. What good was any of this to him?
But look, what they did, they were united. They worked together.
Yep.
And I know we're talking about stuff, but what's going on today, we in the conservative end fight within each other. But I give it to the left. They know what they want, they know how to achieve it, and they know how to get to achieving it.
Yeah.
And they work together as a unit.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to bring out from our first season with Men Without Chests, going back to that episode, and the chipping away of honor and courage and virtue and all the different things that organize the human emotion. That is, it's capped off nicely with removing that saying from West Point, removing that motto from West Point, because all of those things in that quote that's no longer there.
Yep. It's going to be gone.
Is virtue. It is from a morally courageous person, individual.
But that's a virtue of the old world.
It's of the old world. And that Men Without Chests, what C.S. Lewis was pointing to, has come up from education into our military, just like we said, long march to the institutions, to where now the people that are training our fighting force, our fighting men, or at least those that command fighters, they're now men without chest. We have no one with any moral fortitude in the upper echelons of the military anymore. That's not digression, but important.
Yeah.
What do you think, guys? I know we have an essay to get through, but we are a little bit free form here and we can divert if you want to. What are your thoughts on the spiritual and biblical aspect of this, where we are finding it? How we see God's providence working in times like this? Why we are here as a nation, especially as we claim we have become a Christian nation, which we can go back and forth on the definitions, but anyways, we have become on a much more conservative Christian foundation. We really have. And then how we hear and stuff, like, what are your thoughts? Like, because we look at this from the biblical perspective. So this is where we find ourselves today. Why? Anyways, do you see what I'm asking?
I do. I think that's a great question. My mind immediately goes to Psalm 2. Why do the heathen nations rage? Why do the peoples plot in vain? I've set my Messiah, or my anointed, upon Zion, right? Like, this is a rage against the machine. It's a rage against Christ. And if he is in heaven right now, putting all enemies under his feet, well, Marxism has to be put under his feet at some point. Whether you're on-mill, post-mill, I don't care, free-mill even, we all affirm that Christ is putting enemies under his feet. Question is timeline and all that down the road. Who cares? There have to be enemies in order for him to put them under his feet, right? And I think Marxism and, I think all of this is part of his grand story about how he overcame all that opposed him, all that, loved death. He's using it for his purposes. He's using it for his glory. And whether that is at some point him setting up his kingdom, on earth as it is in heaven, when that happens and all that kind of stuff, whatever. All I do know is that Marxism will fall one day in a blaze, and it'll be because Jesus said enough is enough.
I really appreciate you saying this, because it's very easy to get discouraging. And the book Revelation was written for that very reason, that we know that Christ is the
Encourage.
King, Christ
Mm.
rules, he is victorious, and every enemy will bow down and worship Christ and will be dealt with. And with political propagandas, campaigns, especially our year right now, we as Christians, and I know some people, that's all they talk about. I have a particular person close to me. He thinks that November 5th is when probably going to be the return of Christ because of the election and stuff. So my point is very simple. It's so easy to get distracted and forget the promises. And what Chico said, it's such a fresh balm, oil on our wounds and our soul to know that Christ is victorious and we have no reason to be heartbroken or cast down. None. We should rejoice, like you said in Psalm 2, you know.
Mm.
But anyways, thank you for sharing that, man.
Yeah. Just as God says to the sea, this far and no further, he's going to say that. He has said that to Marxism. Right? It's not going to
And
encroach
the reality is
anywhere
that
he
if
doesn't
we
want to.
believe in the sovereignty of God, everything
Mhm.
is happening is because our Lord has decreed these to take place.
Yeah.
It's also lots of Christians that think that our Lord is removed somewhere. This is his doing, not in an aspect of sin, but in his sovereignty. He uses the secondary agents, like the wicked, to do his will, and we should be encouraged and be take the what do you call it? Take the shield, take the sword, and move forward. So, anyways, Jay, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think if you just look at the development of Western civilization and the expansion of Christianity over the last 2,000 years, there's patterns that you can see. You know, early on, early persecutions of Christians, and, God had his design in that, and perfecting his church, and, demonstrating his faithfulness to his people there. And then, after that period of time, the enemy is always working, right? The enemy is crafty. And so after that period of time, the main threat to the church, and to the kingdom of God, were heresies that were coming into the church and leading people astray. And, the church did a pretty decent job of dealing with those. And then we move into medieval times, the Dark Ages, and then the threat that really that came was the dilution, or maybe potentially the perversion of the gospel, that was remedied by the Reformation. And, oftentimes people talk about it, being dark times. And, I think back to, the 1400s, 1300s. And I mean, where you're hard pressed to find the gospel preached anywhere, in any church. I mean, that to me seems like a much darker time than where we are now. But the glory of the Reformation came along, and we all benefited immensely from that. And as that cycle, of course, has continued, or that pattern continues, now we see this this emerging threat that really has been emerging for a couple hundred years almost. And this is just the stage that we're at. And it is part of God's sovereign decree, part of his sovereign design, and it is for the good of his people. And I think that, particularly when we talk about our own society, our own American context, there are elements, I think, from our founding that our founders got wrong. So Max, the original question was, what's God doing in the midst of this? I'm going to tell you one thing that I hope that he's doing. I'm not a prophet, so I don't know, but this is one thing that I really hope. I think our founders made a few critical errors. And one of them is related to the First Amendment and the function of religion in our society. And of course, they're operating within Christendom when they write these things. And so when they're talking about freedom of religion and how Congress shouldn't, write any law with respect to the establishment of religion, they're talking about the establishment of a state-run denomination. Their assumption is that we're a Christian society. And of course, Christians are going to be here and running society and all of those things, and it's going to be built upon natural law and God's revelation. But they weren't explicit in any of that, and it left this little hole for the
that
enemy
has been
to
exploited.
sneak into, a little foothold, and it's taken a long, long time. But now freedom of religion, which is a great thing. I think I've been a part of several different denominations, and that's been a wonderful thing. But now freedom of religion has now become freedom from religion, and it's now the state's duty to keep religion away from you, to keep Christian religion away from you. And here's
Sorry to interrupt, but and by doing so, establishing a state religion
yeah,
of atheism. But
yeah,
yes,
yeah, of course, yeah. But I hope that one of the things that God is doing by bringing all these things crumbling down is so that we can remedy that in whatever society is built in the aftermath.
yeah, I really like that. Did you guys see the video of the pastor in Ohio? He was a CRE pastor, and it was just a short clip of him talking about how the First Amendment needed to be washed away. Did you guys see that?
Yeah, I saw that.
It wasn't just like liberals and conservatives alike pulling their hair out, but it was conservative ACA, Christians that really exposed this. And, it's all about the two kingdom versus theonomy and all those things that we don't need to go into. But for you to critique that is sacrosanct, right? Like, the First Amendment is almost held on level with the inspired Word of God in a lot of Christians' understanding how they talk about these things, their ethos, right? Their ethos. And so I don't want people to just cut you out whenever they hear you say that, because while we want freedom of speech, we want freedom of religion, what we want is a more concise, well-explained understanding of these things that would preclude the nonsense that we're dealing with today. And this isn't tyranny. That's one of the things that they were saying, is that we just want, a Christian tyranny. Well, that's laughable, because you can't define tyranny outside of God's law, but put that aside. We really need to have the intellectual honesty to examine these documents that are not inspired and improve them moving forward. And that's what I really like about Neil Gordon's essay. And I know it's several episodes down the road where we actually start talking more about that. And I think you've kind of given us a good summary of sorts of what's to come. But we do need to be thinking through how we are going to, or what kind of society we're going to rebuild this into. And so, yeah, I think that was a great deviation, Max. Not
One more other thought that I was thinking as we got talking about this is it's interesting how God always brings idols forth. He allows those idols to come forth, people will worship them, and then he destroys them. He says, I am Yahweh, I am the Lord your God, and he says, I am one, and there is no other God besides me. And I'm combining different scriptures together, but it's the same meaning. And I think it's crucial for us, especially for our generation, for our culture, to know who true God is. And so all of these things, what's happening, it's really showing how we as people make idols in Constitution, amendments, that even human documents were given to us as an aid to our governing. We took it and we elevated to the level of a written word of God. And we make idols. Like Hebrews made idols, we do the same thing all the time. And I think it's important for the church to really start seeing these things, to see what is what. Marxism is an idol of a society, and it will show all of its ugliness. And then the proclamation of the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ will show the truth about what Marxism is and who he is and what Christianity is. So I think it's very valuable actually to see these things, to see these idols being risen up and brought up and being worshipped, and then the gospel of Jesus Christ will crush them and destroy them, and we'll see the beauty of Christ in it. I think it's a wonderful thing to see them. We should not run away from it, but be able to face them and stand them and deal with these false gospels, because there is only one gospel. That is the gospel of Christ. And so we should be encouraged by this, because God is working in that, and he is exposing the wickedness, and he will deal with this, because his promise is sure and amen, that Christ is the king and he is coming, he reigns, that is his kingdom, he won the war, and there is nothing we can do to stop it as a humankind, because he is the king of the universe. That is the reality. And no matter how much the state trying to tell us otherwise, I got
So
you get the point.
No, that's fantastic. I will say the thing that I'm thinking about as you say that is, what is the biggest idol today of many people in the church and outside of the church alike? It's the state.
Yep.
100% the state.
It's the state.
And you do not hear that being preached in pulpits. I've been in pulpits. I've been in more churches than I care to admit, right? Like, I've been around. And generally when idolatry is spoken of at all, it's spoken of, well, your cell phone is really probably your idol, or even your family, or, they bring out all these things that we make idols. And I don't want to say that that's wrong per se. What I want to say is we're missing the biggest one of the day. It's like going to the people that are sacrificing their children on the burning arms of Molech, right? And saying, you know what, your idolatry really needs to be confronted. You're really over concerned about how your husband feels about such and such. And it's like we're so good at pointing out stupid idols that people have, but we're not good at pointing out the idol, right? As evangelicals. And there's plenty of idols, there's a plethora of idols. We are very religious people, just like the people in Athens. We are. And there is an unknown God that most of them will even say, I thank God for whatever, such and such. But they don't know him. But they do know the state. And they serve him, and there was nothing more clear of that service, that worship, than what happened in 2020 with the COVID nonsense and the lockdowns and all the orders. They fell in line without question.
Yep.
As if God from on high told them to lock down.
So this is, going back to Grimsky and his march through the institutions, this is one of the things that has taken place without anyone noticing. The Pledge of Allegiance, which dates back all the way back to the 1890s, was written by a socialist with the design of replacing God with the state. And they brought it into the government school system, and they removed the recitation of the creeds and supplanted it with the Pledge of Allegiance. And
I want to say something about that, okay? Ever since our reforms, I have had a very big problem with the Pledge of Allegiance, just by virtue of what I was reading in the scriptures, okay? I didn't know why I had a problem with it. And then, I just stopped doing it, right? And people will look at you all kinds of funny whenever that happens, right? But then I felt so vindicated whenever I realized that was what was going on.
Yeah.
And Pete Hegseth's book, The Battle of the American Mind, really helped solidify that in me. Like, no, we'll not say your filthy Pledge of Allegiance. It is designed to supplant the God who created all things. And we as Christians should reject it out of hand. Even when it says under God.
Yes,
this is not under God.
Yeah. Under God was added, I think, by Eisenhower in the 50s.
The 50s, yeah.
Yeah. And it's a great illustration of what's happening in so many ways, where we think that,
Syncretism.
well, if we could just get prayer back into the schools, then the schools will be fine. Or, if we could just elect the right person to the right office, then, everything will get better. And with the Pledge of Allegiance, the thinking was, well, if we just insert the phrase under God, then it will be fine. And what that ends up doing is it sort of baptizes statism. And it
Yep.
allows us to continue literally pledging our allegiance to the federal government and feeling good about it as though it's a good Christian thing to do. And so, I mean, it's brilliantly done by our enemies, and we have not noticed what has
The
happened.
serpent is crafty.
Yeah.
Serpent is crafty.
So are we.
Nice. I love it. I want that.
I had this in my yard in Colorado. All people were confused. And that is our pledge. What your brother is saying, it's true. If you look at this, it all has the same principles. The beast is doing the same thing that the church is doing. That's the war. But the lamb is victorious. The dragon's head is crushed. The serpent is no more. And it's still alive. Its tentacles in still places. And we see this working out. We look in the Middle Age, we look Catholic Church, what was the beast then, what was doing today. It's the same thing. There is nothing new under the sun. This is why it's important to read the scriptures and understand, and with wisdom apply those principles, so we can determine these things and stand against them. And I think Christians, unfortunately, today, we have multiple Bibles in our households, which is very different from the history past, and yet we are one of the most uneducated Christians of all times. It's sad, but that's the reality, that we don't understand what we do, why we do. We just blindly follow and do what we are told to do, and we pledge allegiance to the beast when we ought to pledge allegiance to the Lamb. That's it. So yeah, it's very convincing, and we must know this. If you're a Christian who is listening to this, consider to what we're saying. Who is your king? Who is your God? And whom do you pledge allegiance at the end of the day? So, thank you guys for your input. We can come back, and we are at 53 minutes now.
Well, let's jump back into Gordon, and I think we can get up to where we're currently at in the stages of the modern American Revolution here pretty quickly. He says the first stages of a revolution are identified by protest, violence, and propaganda. Right, so those preliminary things, those obviously have been here for decades. But the first stage, there's always protest, violence, and propaganda. And Gordon goes into this long list of all the protest, all of the violence, and all of the propaganda. He talks about the Summer of Love in 2020, all the things that we've already been addressing. He talks about propaganda, and he simply asks the question, have you watched CNN lately? It's pure propaganda. News doesn't even exist anymore. I keep joking that I get all my news from the Babylon Bee, but it's not a joke. I actually do, because you can't get news anywhere. There is no news. It's pure propaganda. That's all that exists on any news network. And so these things have happened. And he says that the first stage of the revolution in this country is complete. The old regime is gone.
Yeah.
As we've been talking and we've been reminiscing about the institutions of the old regime, they don't exist anymore. There's sort of shadows of them and vestiges of them. The second regime, or the new regime, as Britton refers to it, uses aspects of the old regime when it's advantageous to do so, but for all intents and purposes, it's gone. And what Gordon says is, if it feels like you're not living in the place that you thought you were, it's because you aren't. If it feels like, for those of us who, went through elementary school 40 years ago or earlier, if it feels like we don't live in the same country that we were studying when we took American history class in 6th grade, it's because we aren't living there anymore. The place
Right.
we live is completely different.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and that much is obvious when you sit down, look around at what exists, and notice what doesn't exist anymore. The new regime has taken over, and if Britton is correct, it's a regime of moderates who are using the levers of government left over from the old regime, and there is a group of extremists who are gaining power, creating their own institutions. Gordon mentions Meta and BLM. You could throw Google in there and AI stuff and a whole bunch of other things. But they're creating their own institutions that are going to be vying for power, and there will be this struggle. And this is where he says we are right now. We're in this period of dual sovereignty where the reign of the moderates is in control, but there's a group of extremists who are going to begin critiquing those moderates and will eventually supplant them. And so Joe Biden and the other moderates who are in control now will disappear. They will go away, and the extremists will come into power. And he says that hasn't happened yet. But when it does, the very next thing that happens is the reign of terror, where everything and everyone with any connection to the old regime is systematically raised and eliminated.
Yep. The history has proven this, and this will be no different. If that is God's will.
He actually says in here somewhere that we're in this period of dual sovereignty now, and the extremists will soon take over. And he's writing this summer of 2022, so a year and a half ago. And his prediction was that the moderates would be replaced by the extremists somewhere between November 2022 and November 2024. That's his prediction. Maybe not, I don't know, but we're in that window right now. And, the next, 7-8 months are going to be one of the most interesting periods of time in our history, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to talk a little bit about the dual sovereignty that's clearly in place. You mentioned Meta, you mentioned Google. If you find yourself questioning, there's not another set of institutions that's vying for control. Like, if you find yourself in that mindset right now, just think about all the censorship on social media and how that affects elections. Think about information that's held back from you by these institutions. Think about all the different congressional committee hearings where the two sources of sovereignty are vying for control. Think about Mark Zuckerberg in front of the committee of old men that didn't have a clue what he was talking about, but they were trying to rein him in, and they couldn't. Think about all these different things that are taking place on C-SPAN over the last 10 years. Dual sovereignty is here. It's here. You do have institutions vying for control, and they're all on the left on one side, and the old regime on the other side, shadows of the old regime, because they're occupied by spineless, witless men and women. But it is one of those things where I hear Gordon, making this prediction, and I know that he's telling the truth on where we are. And it may not be November 2024, and maybe a little bit after, where the extremists take over. But we're primed for it because we have an invalid in the White House, and they have the best opportunity in the world to supplant him with the next extremist. That's why some people are saying Michelle Obama. Some people are saying, Gavin Newsom. I don't think he's extreme enough. I think he's still a little bit more moderate than others. It's coming. It's coming. And you're an idiot if you. Yeah, exactly. He's the left's darling, that nobody's really floating.
Oh, yes.
So a recent interview that Tucker Carlson did with G. Van Fleet, who wrote a book called Mal's America. It's a fantastic interview. You should watch it if you haven't.
Absolutely.
But she lived through the Cultural Revolution in China. And the whole interview was basically asking her about her experience of seeing things happening here, going all the way back to the 80s and the 90s. And it's picked up a lot in the last 10 years. But seeing certain things being like, oh, yeah, I recognize that. That happened in China during the Cultural Revolution. Oh, yeah, I recognize that. That also happened in China. And one of the things that she said near the end of the interview is that the communist takeover of America is complete.
Yep.
And that's exactly what Gordon is saying, that this revolution has happened. It's not as though it's going to happen in the future. We got to be careful and make sure we get the right people in office so that it doesn't happen. It has happened. And it is complete. The new regime is here. This is where we live.
Yeah.
And the reign of terror, if Britton is correct, is in the near future.
And Cole, back to your point, you said, well, you're not sure, how did you say that Gordon is a prophet or prophesied, whatever word you used. But all Gordon did is that actually he did a very basic work that anybody is capable of. He looked at the history, he pulled out the principles that were used, that were noted by other people that are quite intelligent and can determine from A to B the difference. And he just points it out. And like the interview with Carlson Tucker, and etc., all I'm just trying to say is very simple. It's nothing new. Anybody can look at this, analyze it, and make the same conclusion. It's not like we're coming up with some conspiracy theory. We're just looking what has happened in our country, and we're applying this to ages past. We're drawing the same principle that we used before. We are just looking, how is this the same or how is this different? And back to our point is that the revolution has taken place. And how do we move forward now? It's for us to move forward, we need to understand where we're at. We need to find the place of our location on the map, find where we want to go, and there is no way around it. We have to make the decisions.
And that's how Gordon ends this section of his essay, is saying this is where we are. We've got to recognize where we are, and the time to do something about it is now. And he actually identifies this little window, and actually uses Marxist terminology. The Marxists, as they plan revolutions, they also prepare for what they call counter-revolution, which is something that comes about typically during this stage of dual sovereignty, where there's a group who seeks to reestablish some of the principles of the old regime. And they call them counter-revolutionaries because they want to go back to the way that it was before the new regime took over. And Gordon says that the best time for the counter-revolution to succeed is in this period of dual sovereignty, because they aren't fully established yet. They're sort of fighting internally with themselves. They have, in some sense, exposed their soft underbelly. And they haven't taken full control of everything yet. And this is the time when the counter-revolution should act. And so he ends this section of his essay saying that's where we are now. And we must act now, because if we don't act before the reign of terror, we won't have the opportunity to act once that starts. And let me just say one other thing, because I read this article on CNN this morning that said something about, is civil war in America possible? And the whole thing went through and it talked about all these, white supremacist extremists and Christian nationalists and all these, crazy people who want some bloody civil war where they go around killing a whole bunch of people, which is pure propaganda. Gordon doesn't want that. I don't want that. You two don't want that. I don't know anyone who wants that.
No.
My wife comes home from nursing school. Yeah, exactly. My wife comes home from nursing school and tells me stories about the things that she saw and did, and I'm like, I don't want to see blood. I have no interest whatsoever. I don't want to harm anyone. I don't want to hurt anyone. I would just like to be left alone and be able to live faithfully in accordance with God's law. And that's what Britton is going to argue for in the next section of his essay.
Yep.
And with that, we are towards the end of our episode here. But I do want to ask our listeners if any of this has made sense to you, if you're really resonating with what's being said. This is important stuff. And there are other people talking about these things, but I think there needs to be more. And so there's two things that you can do to help. And really, one thing is umbrella. Like, subscribe, share the show, let people know about the important topics that we're discussing this season. But there's also Neil Gordon's essay, which we have posted with his permission on our website, bereans.wordpress.com. Please go read the essay. Share the essay. We can't get it out without your help. And so I must say, it is probably the most concise explanation of where we've been and where we are and where we're going that I've ever seen. And I listen to people like Tucker Carlson, Alex Jones, like all these people that have been talking about these things don't seem to quite put things together in the same way. And while Max's point is right, anybody could be doing this thing. This is a place where it's done well. You read through the essay and send it to your congressman, send it to your senators. I don't care. Like, let's get this out. Let's make some noise and continue to listen to us over the next several weeks as we finish the essay and discussing the essay. Does anybody have anything to add before we end the episode?
Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to us. May our Lord be with you, and everything you have to do, may He will bless. It is according to His will. And thank you for coming and listening to us. Brothers, it was wonderful to talk to you, and thank you for this time.
Yeah, there is hope. There's actually great hope. And
Absolutely.
yeah, the time is now, so let's do it.
Time is now. Let's do it.
And where Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, and we should never forget that.
Amen. We'll see you guys next week.
See you.
The kings who fight against my Lord shall taste his wrath and meet his sword upon